Welcome everyone to the Academy of the Impossible and our campaign school, which is a regular series we have to facilitate greater participation in the political process. Generally, we believe that if politics can be demystified, both for present participants and our friends on YouTube, that there'll be more reason and more interest for people to get involved in general. We've had a very rich and somewhat diverse group of guests over the past several months, and it's a great pleasure tonight that we have David Herle, who really represents what's part of our second season of Campaign School, which is to get beyond the kind of platitudes and spin and into the actual reality of campaign work. One of the downsides of inviting politicians who are currently in office is there's very real limits to what they are able to say in terms of how politics works, and that's totally understandable. So we were fortunate enough to have Adrian Montgomery here as our last guest, who is a Tory conservative campaigner. So it's great to have David, who's worked for the Liberal Party, to get certainly a contrast. But I suspect...
The losing perspective?
Well, not necessarily the losing perspective. But I mean, like Adrian, I think what is of interest to our members is the transition from being a volunteer to being a professional. That there are lots of people who participate in politics on the stuffing of envelopes level.
Right.
But what's interesting is how you move up to the campaign chair, how you move up to work on leadership campaigns, of which there seem to be a lot of leadership campaigns right now.
Absolutely.
So without any further introduction, I always like to start with the question of how did you get politicized? I mean, what is it that got you interested in politics as a young person, or perhaps as a relatively young person? And what was it that sort of got you more than just politicized, but really eager to get into politics as a blood sport, as an actual active campaign?
Yeah. Interesting question. I thought about it a lot over the years. I'm not sure that I figured it all out, but I know that there's a few things that are important. I grew up in Saskatchewan. That's my home. And it's an unusual place for a Liberal to come from. And I guess I would say the most important things were an idea that captivated me, and then mentoring through the piece. So I was in high school when the 1979 election was occurring between Pierre Trudeau and Joe Clark. And we were learning in high school in that year to write a term paper. And so I decided that I would write my term paper on the downfall of Pierre Trudeau in Canadian politics, which it seemed like that was on its way to occurring. And in the course of researching the paper, there was this big fight about ideas about the country back in that time, and Joe Clark had a vision of the country of what he called a community of communities, in which the central government played a relatively modest role, and in which provinces and regions were really free to develop themselves as they saw fit. Canada would be a looser federation, and of course Trudeau and the Liberals took the opposite perspective. And over the course of researching the paper and following that campaign as it occurred, I found, to my surprise, being a high school student, that I had a view. And I identified much more strongly with the Trudeau perspective on the country than I did with the other. And so then, being a naive kid, Trudeau was coming to town and to do a rally at the Hotel Saskatchewan in Regina. And I went to see him speak, and it was a very dramatic thing. They were really running, trying to emphasize Trudeau's strength versus Clark's weakness as a person. And so there was no phalanx of supporters or candidates around Trudeau. He was alone on the stage in front of the largest Canadian flag you'll ever see. And he had his gunslinger pose, and he was a very impressive guy. And then as he was finished and leaving, people lined up to shake his hand as he went out. And I didn't know any better, so I got in the line. And as he came by me, I very quickly blurted out this paper that I was writing and what it was called, right? And what it was called, and I said I'd love to talk to him about it, as if that's even conceivable or possible. And he actually says to me, well, go wait in the foyer, and somebody will come gather you up. So I go and I stand in the foyer, and some aide comes along and whisks me into an anteroom, and I sit there by myself for a few minutes, and then in walks the Prime Minister of Canada, who proceeds to sit down and talk to me for about 10 minutes about my paper and what he thinks about my thesis and where he might quarrel with things that I think he's done wrong or right. And I became an immediate volunteer. I left there and I went to my constituency office and got involved in that campaign. And then I successively came across, and part of this was because there's so few Liberals in Saskatchewan that if you have a young person that comes along that shows any interest, they gather you up and gobble you up, and so that happened to me, and so I had a number of mentors, the most significant of which would have been Ralph Goodale, who really took me under his wing. I was a kid, and he saw potential in me, and so he hired me to be his organizer in Saskatchewan. He was the provincial leader at the time of a party that had no support, so this was a real exercise in learning how to do grassroots organization. Because
and tell me about what that would be like, both the role of an organizer, but the role of an organizer when you're not the most popular party, when you don't have the type of resources that your competitors would have.
It means a lot of things. It means you spend I've been to every community in Saskatchewan in my 1973 Plymouth Valiant. And what?
V8?
No, the Slant 6. Yeah. And I went everywhere, and what it was the Liberal Party. I mean, basically, back in those days, we were just trying to put some skeletal structure together, and the party had, not that long before, been very strong. The Liberal Party suffered a precipitous decline in Saskatchewan throughout the 1970s, but as recently as 1971, it had been the government. So now we're talking 1981. So it's 10 years later. It's not that far gone. So a lot of what my job consisted of was going to communities and taking the old membership list and going around and seeing who's still prepared to help, who's still prepared to organize or put something together. And then the other big part of it was candidate recruitment, because we wanted to run a full slate of candidates so that we could look like we were a real party, and we had really only a chance to elect Ralph in his riding, but we felt that the facade of a full provincial party, of him being the leader of a real party, was important. So we had to recruit candidates, and when you have literally no support, finding 62 people to run is not an easy thing to do. I'll tell you how difficult it is. I ended up running. My name was on a ballot in a riding I had nothing to do with, the riding of Rosetown Elrose. You can look up the results. I think I got 278 votes. I finished fourth, behind the Conservatives who won, the NDP who were second, the Western Canada Concept, which was a Western separatist party at the time, and then me. And had there been another candidate, I quite likely would have been fifth, an independent.
But yeah, as some members of Parliament for the NDP in Quebec would, certainly attest, you never know what's going to happen.
You never know, but we didn't quite get the orange wave in Saskatchewan in that election. And so I met Ralph, and then Ralph brought Paul Martin out to speak to a Saskatchewan convention. And so I met Paul Martin, and he became my next great mentor in politics. And, we sort of grew up really together in politics, because we met in the early 1980s, and he was a long way from even running for Parliament at that point. I went to work for him in Canada Steamship Lines in Montreal for a couple of years, and so that was really well,
it's interesting. I mean, both the personal contact, the anecdote of you and Trudeau was fascinating, because even though he's a prime minister, he's spending 10 minutes with some high school kid about his paper. I mean, it paid off, because, as you say, you instantly went and became a volunteer. I mean, that speaks to how important that human contact is. But the mentorship side, I think doubly so.
If I hadn't been picked up by Ralph, I likely would have just drifted away over time. There was nothing really going on. If you weren't part of his little circle, there wasn't anything of real interest happening. I likely would have just, actually gotten my BA in the 3 years that
it was expected of.
As opposed to the 7 years that
but yet,
ended up taking me.
But yet, by the sounds of it, you got a really well-rounded education in the political process, both in terms of being a party at the margins, but also in terms of, I suppose, the provincial experience was juxtaposed with the federal experience, where the Liberals obviously were a major player federally.
Yeah, and that was the exciting part of being involved at that point. And so I guess the other person I forgot to mention was just people come along and they give you ideas. And so there's this guy named Bruce Ogilvie who was from Humboldt, Saskatchewan, was a nephew of a guy named Otto Lang, if anybody's ever heard of that name before, was a senior minister under Trudeau. Mm-hmm. And this guy was a really dynamic guy, and he came to me and he said, listen, we have to get involved in the Federal Liberal Party. I know you're a provincial guy and you're working with Ralph, but we have to get involved in the Federal Liberal Party because there's just no connection here. And the party's failing the region, and the party in the region is failing the party nationally, and we got to go to Ottawa and try to make a difference. And so he really inspired me to do that. And so that's when I ran for the national executive of the Young Liberals of Canada in the early 1980s. And so that's then how I got involved in federal politics and started to, literally for the first time in my life, meet people from outside of Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned Paul Martin, and it's interesting how you say that you worked with him, before he was even running for office, let alone for the leadership. Yeah. I mean, both Adrian Montgomery and Bill Fox, when they were here, talked about the role of loyalty in terms of fostering the type of trust that exists amongst, those types of trusted circles. Is that the same in terms of having that long-term relationship with Paul that then allowed you to play such a central role as he ran for leader and was leader?
Well, I think in some respects we have a little bit of a father-son type of relationship, because I was so young when we first met, but he was incredibly loyal to all of his people, and you just knew that about him. I'll just give you a very good example. I mean, the 2004 election, which I think the Liberal Party would take those results right now if they could get them. But the results of the 2004 election, where we only won 135 seats, was considered to be a disaster for the Liberal Party, and it was considered to have been a disastrous campaign that I was in charge of. And the very first question that he got at his news conference the day after the election was, are you going to fire Herle in your campaign team? Right? And I wasn't there, but I knew he'd get asked it, and we didn't discuss it, and I knew what he would say. I just knew what he would say. I didn't have any fear about that. Whereas, a guy like poor Ian Davey that was doing the same job for Michael Ignatieff found out on the radio, right? That he'd been fired. Well, that's going to come back and bite you, right? If you treat people that way. So no, the length of time, and I mean, Paul's thing was quite unique because Paul really ended up running for the leadership for about 14 years, from 1988, say, to 2003, and so the same people were involved through that whole period of time, added people, but the core group had been there from the get-go. And so everybody was extremely close. People ask me if I'd like to go back and do politics again. And part of the reason why I think I probably wouldn't is that I'd never be able to replicate that experience again. It wasn't just the trust that I had in him or that he had in me. It was the trust that I had in all of the people and we all had in each other. There was a sense among the whole group that we all had each other's backs and that we all had a like-minded view of the world, and that there was very little dissension in that core group of people. And that just made a pretty special thing. And I don't think that can't be replicated by a campaign like, say, the Trudeau campaign now that's being put together in a couple of months and people are getting to know each other. That's just not going to be the same thing. Well, and we felt, and the thing about Paul was he made it feel like it was a collaborative effort. that we were staffers to him. That you genuinely would have a chance to persuade him of your point of view. And if that whole group felt something and he felt differently, the odds are very high he would go with the group, right?
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, the way in which both motivation, whether it's from recruitment and retention to that ongoing loyalty, I mean, on the one hand, it's clear that the social bond is part of the draw. I mean, part of it, yes, is when you have a commitment, say, to make the world a better place. But that sense of fraternity, it seems to me, is really what motivates people to work those crazy hours, to burn both ends of the candle, as it were, during a campaign. So I'm curious from your perspective, in working through all the different levels, what are the characteristics of either a candidate or, let's say, a campaign manager around that motivation and morale issue? I mean, how do you build a group like that? Because as you're describing it, I mean, that was part of Paul Martin's success, was the loyalty he had over those, as you say, 14 years.
Right.
For someone who wants to get into politics, are there any insights you could offer on how those types of bonds are forged beyond just trial and error and, the battle that is politics? What are some of the, as Trudeau did with you, the small things that allow a leader to build that team, to build that group?
First of all, it's a young person's game. The hours, the time, mental, energy, commitment that's required really make politics. Like if we took that whole Martin team and tried to do another election, we wouldn't be as good anymore. Like people just moved on; they get kids. Some people are, tired, whatever. And so it's a group. It was a group of people in their 30s and 40s, and some in their 20s who do that together. So the first thing is oftentimes people don't take those people all that seriously, right? And view them as functionaries. And what I was lucky with the mentors I had is that they didn't just treat me as somebody that was supposed to do menial work. I did a lot of menial work over the years.
But there's a lot of empowerment.
There was a lot of empowerment that went along with it. And so the fact that as a very young guy, the fact that somebody like Ralph would take me seriously and that I'd have a chance to talk about things with him, that was very important. And then similarly with Paul at a different stage. So I think that is is probably the most important attribute of it. I mean, you certainly don't have to be the nicest person in the world, in the sense that a lot of these people are very, very driven and highly demanding. Only a very rare kind of personality can get to that job. So I'm not pretending that every personal interaction was lovely or wonderful, right? I've had horrible conversations with Paul Martin, horrible conversations. We're yelling and screaming at each other about failures of mine or his. But at the end of the day, which is where I just go back to your intro a little bit, I wouldn't, as you look at the social part of it, underestimate the altruistic side of it. Because, I don't know, maybe everybody's deluding yourselves. Maybe politics doesn't matter. Maybe it can't make a difference. But I'm now entirely working in the private sector. And I've had the opportunity to work on some very interesting projects. But I don't care about those things the way I cared about what I was doing in politics, right? At the end of the day, do I really care about how much you sell of your stuff, right? It's an intellectually interesting exercise to help you sell more of it. But I'm probably not going to lie in bed at night thinking about how to make you sell more of it. Whereas if you're trying to implement a national child care program and bring something like that into place, you really think you're doing something important. And that's a big part of the motivation.
And it's interesting, on the one hand, I think no one would argue that politics today, whether federally, provincially, or municipally, isn't either A, high stakes, and B, really combative. I mean, it's clear that there are issues to fight about and fights that are worth having. And yet it seems as if it's difficult to maintain interest in politics as a whole. Is that something that you've experienced in your career? I mean, going back to the provincial Saskatchewan Liberals, obviously trying to get people interested in the party then was a bit of a heavy lifting.
Yeah, but they were interested in politics. I mean, the turnout rates in Saskatchewan were always very high, in the high 70s, 80%. I mean, that's been such a big change over my time in politics, has been the declining voter participation. Like the 1988 election, as recently as that, I think the voter turnout was 78% or something like that. We're now under 60, which I think changes the way politics is played, and the parties are doing less to appeal to the broad population and more to motivate their own voters to get out to vote, which leads to a harsher clash than the others do, because most nonpartisans aren't really interested in politicians fighting. And that hard politics turns people off. But if they're already turned off and they're not voting anyway, then you're just appealing to your partisans, who the harder you hit the other side, the more they're likely to like it.
And every election cycle seems to mean harder hits, and the desire to hit even harder to get your base that much more mobilized.
Yeah, and I think that it's feeding on itself, because I think the cumulative effect is that it's turning people off. I also think that there's a real sort of bit of a crisis of relevance of the federal government in the country right now, and I suppose this isn't to be too partisan a session, but the range of issues that's even being considered or talked about in Ottawa these days is so narrow that a lot of people with real life problems would never see that as a place where their problem's going to get addressed or solved. There's so many big issues that really matter to people, whether it's pensions or child or elder care or the environment, that have disappeared from the public discourse at the federal level, as the Conservatives have been very, very successful at shrinking the issue base down to the things they want to talk about, right? So we will not talk about climate change, but we will talk about human smuggling, as if these are equivalently important issues, right?
And to be clear, you can be as partisan as you like. I'm the one who's going to be non-partisan in the
well, I don't think the group came here to hear a pitch about the Liberal Party. So
no, but it's curious how you describe both the decline in voter turnout and the need to mobilize the base. I mean, from your perspective, both as when you were running campaigns, but also now as you look at campaigns, I mean, what is the balance between communicating to promote ideas and to look at that altruist bigger picture, and just mobilizing and just pressing the buttons to make sure that your automatons show up at the ballot box regardless of what the big issues of our day need to be?
Well, I think that I missed that entirely when I was there. I think that I was running a persuasion campaign, not a motivation campaign. And it's probably more effective to run a motivation campaign. But the role of altruism in the voter base, I have so many discussions. I've probably not had more controversial discussions with anybody about any subject in politics over the years than I have had about negative advertising and the role that negative advertising plays in campaigns. And we can talk about the morality of it or the appropriateness of it, but as a tool, if I ran another campaign, I wouldn't put anything else on the air. I go negative from start to finish. It is these days a lot easier to convince people of something shitty about another politician than it is to convince them of something good about your own politician. And in 2004, we started the campaign with a series of beautifully shot in 35 millimeter by a big advertising agency commercials of Paul out at Harrington Lake, talking very high-mindedly about his dreams for the country in such areas as alternative energy and things like that. And the Conservatives came out of the gate hard at us on corruption and sponsorship, and we lost the framing of that election right off the bat. That election was not about wind power, as it turns out, right? And not going to be about wind power. It wasn't until we started hitting back at Harper that we could get any traction going in that campaign. And I saw other pieces of evidence about it as well. And even Obama's such a hero to a lot of people that they don't want to sort of acknowledge some of the baser things about him. But that was an enormously negative campaign that Obama ran. They probably won the thing with the attacks on Bain Capital over the course of the late summer and early fall. And so that's just the way it goes.
Well, and certainly the federal Conservative Party have been very aggressive in their negative attack ads on every potential leader they may face. And I'm sure that they've got an archive of footage of the B potential.
Oh my God, I'm sure they're salivating about Trudeau, but they may get more than they bargained with him, I'll say that. But the thing about negative advertising that is just a little bit on the other side of the ledger is it doesn't work if it's not true.
Right.
It's not completely true, but neither are the positive ads completely true that you run. They're advertising. But if the negative ad doesn't have, at its core, a kernel of truth, if Canadians didn't really believe that probably Michael Ignatieff was just coming back here to try to get this job, then that wouldn't have worked, right?
But your point about the framing, that the negative ad can certainly shift the frame away from the positive you want to have to the negative they want to have. So the focus may still be on your leader, but not in the frame that you desire, because now it's become a negative rather than a positive.
Well, that's, I mean, and especially with somebody that's as unknown to the public as, say, Mr. Ignatieff was, that he was a completely blank slate, and they were the first ones to write on that slate. And, you know, most people are only going to ever know a few facts about anything in politics. And so if you can get yours in early, that's how they'll think about that person.
Now, it's curious to shift towards leadership campaigns in the context of a party. I mean, to what role do you think negative advertising has and will continue to play on an internal level when, after the election's done, you're all supposed to be on the same side and kind of regroup? And it's not clear that that entirely happened with Ignatieff versus Ray. But Chrétien Martin was somewhat different. I mean, there was some animosity. But, I mean, so I'm curious on that point, to what extent does negative advertising in a leadership campaign both necessary and at the same time...
It's completely different. I've never seen negative attacks in a leadership context work for a candidate for the leadership. And we employed them in desperation in 89-90, and they didn't work for us, and they didn't work for the people who tried it against Turner, and it didn't work for Ignatieff. And especially, I mean, he did not have the standing even in the party to do that. But even if you do, it's just not on. And this is where the people that are running against Trudeau are really going to find it difficult, because they're going to need to take him down a couple of pegs to have any chance of beating him. But the party will react extremely badly by any attempt to damage him. Right? He's likely to be the guy, so why are you going to damage him? Everybody remembers those ads with Ignatieff saying to Dion, "You just didn't get it done," that the Conservatives put on, and why are you going to give the Conservatives their next wave of advertising? And secondly, it's just, you know, people in political parties tend to think of themselves as sort of in a family, and, you know, we all have to make this work at the end. So there's definitely a Marcus of Queensbury rules about leaderships that I don't see changing anytime soon. And
what about the Ontario Provincial the Ontario Provincial Liberal leadership campaign? I mean, it's a similar thing where you can't necessarily slag McGuinty as sort of the old premier going out, but yet you kind of have to differentiate yourself in terms of, I mean, he didn't leave on an up note. So,
they never do.
Right. So is whoever the next leader of the Provincial Liberals, will they be able to do so in that same context?
So this is one of the biggest challenges anybody faces, and it was certainly the biggest challenge we faced, and we screwed it up royally. But I look back and I don't know how what better course of action there would have been, because of that dynamic I've just talked about. Managing that turnover, when politicians leave office, they leave because they were either defeated or they're on the verge of certain defeat. They do not leave these jobs if there's any chance in their own mind they're going to be able to hold on to the job, right? So when they do step down, like McGuinty or like Mulrooney in '93 or whatever, the party is in grave crap, right? And so if you're going to have any chance of success, you need to show something different. You need to look like you're change. You have to respond to what happens to all governments, which is a pent-up desire for change. One of Paul's problems internally in the party is that people thought that we didn't have to represent change when we took over from Chrétien because everything had been going so swimmingly. But we knew that the only reason things had been going swimmingly was that there was no alternative, and there was a growing demand for change, and we had to represent change if we were going to be successful, and that was dramatized enormously with the sponsorship issue when that emerged. And then you definitely had to be change, but you're not allowed to represent change. The party won't allow you. So they'll often turn to an outsider looking for the facade of change, as the Liberal Party did in 1984 when it turned to John Turner, right? So you look like change, you look different, you weren't around here. But we won't allow you to vary from any of the orthodoxy without wheeling on you and getting you back into line. And in the provincial thing here, so, there's a number of people, a lot of people in the party have the thesis that you need somebody that wasn't around the cabinet table for the Orange issue and for the Mississauga issue, and you need somebody that's removed from those decisions. So that's providing a lot of the energy behind, say, Sandra Pupatello's campaign. But if she tries to really cut the McGuinty government loose once she becomes leader, she'll find that the party will resist that. And and there's nothing more damaging in politics than friendly fire. And when your own people inside your party are turning on you, that's when both the media and the public say, you guys don't have your own act together. I can't trust you with this responsibility anymore because you can't even agree amongst yourselves.
Well, and it's funny, if I could unite a bunch of the different threads that you brought up over the course of this evening, I mean, you can't recreate the type of social bond that a really coherent, tight campaign team has, because it's forged over at least a decent amount of time.
Yeah.
And secondly, there clearly needs to be a formalized mentorship in which people who are in the party, people in power, are actively seeking new blood and mentoring that blood and getting them into positions of importance, of responsibility. I mean, is that happening? To some extent, is there a recognition of that type of broader party renewal that... I mean, in theory, I suppose candidates like Trudeau are bringing that with him as he sort of moves through and ignites new people into politics.
Well, he may bring new people in, and in fact, I'm sure he will bring new people in. Whether or not they get mentored is a different story. The Conservatives, I think, are doing a much, much better job of this and have been for some time than Liberals are, because the Liberal Party's always been... campaigns and the political organization of the Liberal Party has really always been done by inspired amateurs. And so nobody's actually in politics. I'm not in... I don't do politics for a living. I am a consultant. I have a career. I have a set of expertise. And yet in a certain context, I was thrust into the role of campaign manager. And that would have been true for everybody that was in our organization. They've all gone on to have different lives. Whereas the Conservatives some time ago really started to understand that this was a craft. And this was something that ought to be a profession. And they train people a lot more sophisticatedly. And
well, there's like the Manning Center.
Things like that. Example. Right. And they have a number of vehicles like that, and they are turning out over the last decade a lot of people that are, they fund people to go to campaigns and election seminars, and they're actively building up that capacity for people to, so that even the person running the local campaign in a riding is, whereas for the Liberal, it's probably just the candidate's friend or the riding president. For the Conservatives, it's probably somebody that's really been well trained at what that job entails and what's there. And now that we have fewer people, I don't know that our mentoring is going to get better. But that's something that's a perspective that has to change in the Liberal Party. That this is, we turn over our operations with every new leader. Like the entire thing changes. That people bring in their, We did that after Mr. Chrétien left. We brought in an entire new team, and then after we left, nobody that was involved in Paul Martin was remotely involved in the 2008 election campaign, and nobody that was involved with Mr. Dion in the 2008 election campaign was involved with Mr. Ignatieff in the 2011 campaign. But this is, you're basically throwing amateurs against professionals every election, and amateurs that have barely had any time to even learn their jobs.
I mean, it's a huge head start that certainly the Tories are able to maintain, both on the database side with their constituent information management system that gets so much attention, but on the professionalization side, that both on the knowledge retention and the talent development, it seems like that they're really focusing on the long term versus the other parties.
They're doing that much smarter than anybody else is. I mean, the NDP are trying to get into the game now. They set up the Broadband Center, and they're trying to do some of that. But I think they're still a long way behind the Conservatives as well.
Now, you mentioned, the flip side of the amateurs who come into these roles. I mean, they do have often a professional experience that informs where they're coming from. And in your case, I mean, it's interesting the role that, you can define your own profession rather than have me as an observer, but statistical literacy, numerical literacy, seem to be a real requirement for any level of serious political engagement. Partly because you have to be able to read polls, partly because you have to be able to read numbers in terms of understanding how ridings, how even different parts of a riding break out. It used to be you needed a law degree to really sort of be into politics. Increasingly, it seems that perhaps a background in social science, perhaps a background in hard science is increasingly the case. How much of your own academic and professional background do you think helped enable your ongoing ability to navigate the political world?
Well, I should say, first of all, that many people, including people who are friends of mine and close to me, believe that what I did in combining being the pollster and the campaign chair was an error. And believe that the campaign chair, who's determining strategy, needs to have distance from the pollster so that they can decide that something's not working.
Now,
whereas if you have both produced the evidence to generate the strategy, and then you are tracking how that strategy is doing, you're invested in it in a way that you probably shouldn't be. Is the theory. I thought it was helpful to understand the data as being campaign chair myself.
I was going to ask. I mean, were those people who said that people who also possessed statistical literacy and all, like? I mean, maybe those are people who,
no, they weren't. They were old-style campaign managers.
Yeah.
And they saw polling as an input, but shouldn't be a decisive input.
I mean, we're still in the Nate Silver era right now in terms of the ascendancy of the nerd, in terms of being able to work with numbers. And I can only assume that, many campaign brain trusts are asking themselves those same questions. Especially as Nick Kouvalis' firm gets reprimanded this week for the campaign calling. I mean, there is. When Alan Gregg was here, he was very indicting towards the polling industry and sort of where they've gone in terms of accuracy. And I think it's because he feels there isn't enough literacy in terms of how statistics works and how data can and should be used. I mean, is there an awareness of that as a problem, either from the industry or from the political side?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's true of the work that's done at the high level for politics. I think that polling work that's done for the political parties is done at a very high level of competence.
Because they need it to be.
Because they need it to be, and they pay for it. Most of the crappy polling work is because people don't want to pay. And so either media don't have budgets and they don't pay at all, so they get whatever, they're beggars and they'll take whatever they can get. And then just generally, I think, I know Alan's frustration about the business, and with the advent of SurveyMonkey, people think that anybody can do this, and and you can't.
And anyone's going to try,
right? And I mean, for the first time in a long time now, we have data problems in the polling industry, which was, when polling first started, when there was only a handful of people doing it in the country, getting the data right was the biggest challenge in polling. I'm talking about back in the 60s. And so, the pollster that would be really sought out would be, he's got good numbers. That guy can get the numbers. And then with the advent of computer technology, et cetera, it became relatively simple to do to draw a representative sample and do a survey. And so then people like Alan moved into the ascendancy because of the insight that they brought to data. Everybody could generate good data. Every university, every poli-sci class in any university can generate accurate survey results. But so it was the ability of the interpreter to say, here's what that means and here's what you do with this. And now we're back to a place where you got to question the data because there's so much shoddy online collection out there.
And I mean, do you think that either A, detracts or increases the value of someone like Alan or someone like yourself, who not only has the expertise to check the integrity of the data, but then is able to draw insights that others can't? Like, did you push back against the friends who were saying you shouldn't have combined the roles of data and strategy?
Well, I did it. I did combine those. I did combine those two functions, and I don't think it was a problem. But you may have somebody else come in here and you can ask them. I know my partner Harry Neer, a friend of Alan's, a long time. He advised me strongly that it was an error to do that. But fundamentally, I think that it was survey research that saved our bacon. I mean, as our support was collapsing out from under us, we were able to determine exactly what buttons we needed to push with people. And we knew that a lot of people were going to the Conservatives who knew nothing about their platform, knew nothing about what they stood for, were just angry at the Liberals about corruption and sponsorship and a variety of things, but didn't know what the consequences of a Conservative vote would be. We had a concerted strategy. We started with women. We said that we were going to get the women back first. And that's, so what do we have to say in an advertisement? And so we put on the air what at the time was quite a notorious ad, which featured, among other things, a pistol being fired, a young girl rocking back and forth in an abortion clinic, American-style health care, troops fighting in Iraq. These were the things that we knew that women disagreed with the Conservatives about, and so we said, hey, this is what they are. If you vote for them, this is what they are. And then the next stage, that was quite successful. And then the next stage was for the male voters we need to get back. We went on to fiscal responsibility. And then the last ad we put out in that campaign was there had been partly because of our advertising and partly because of the very timely comments of a number of Conservative backbenchers and various things, there was enough concern about whether or not they represented the social consensus in Canada that our last advertisement was really pitched at suburban families who wanted change in politics but didn't want change in their lives. Their lives were going reasonably well and they just wanted a different set of faces, and we made them wonder whether they would have social peace if Harper was elected. So every one of those ads was very tightly and precisely targeted in every one of its messages at the people that we had determined were the lowest hanging fruit for us to get back. We were doing that in such incredibly tight time frames. The last ad was conceived of on an afternoon and on the air the next morning. And I think if we hadn't had all of the things as tightly, we wouldn't have been able to pull that off. If the pollster was living in Toronto and had to come to Ottawa and try to convince you of what was going on, and then you had to sort of get your head around that and then go to the agency, all of that was right there at Centre Concentrated.
Well, and I think that is a good argument sort of in favor of having someone who, like yourself, is able to run the numbers and then convert that into strategy in such a turnover. And finally, before we open it up to the group, I mean, that's kind of the story of the presidential election, that I think both campaigns probably had incredible ability to target, not just to recognize who amongst their highly profiled voter database, but also get a sense of where the swing was, where the opportunity was. Even in, the battle states like Ohio, I mean, that suggests that data is going to drive campaigns more and more and more, and that you're going to need campaign staff who have that type of literacy. In the years since you were really active in politics, I mean, what has been the major thing that you've noticed change that has maybe made you think, man, I really want to be back in there so I can take advantage of this, beyond just the I would hit them negative first, hard, and always. I mean, is there another aspect to how politics has changed that's really caught your excitement and curiosity?
Well, it's changed enormously. I mean, all the tools. I mean, Twitter didn't exist in the last campaign that I ran. I don't think Facebook existed in the last campaign that I ran, but it certainly wasn't ubiquitous if it did. So and a lot of the voter contact techniques that the Conservatives have become very adept at, and the Obama campaign is very adept at. So the fact that Obama uses them too means that they're not inherently evil. They're just tactics, and I think it would be exciting to see if you could get more people excited about something. If you could use those tools to reach out to people who are not otherwise getting engaged somehow. And, that's one of the theories about turnout, that he is connecting with a very non-traditional group of people and connecting with them in non-traditional ways. So, that might be, I'm playing a little bit of a role in that campaign, and that might be one of the areas that I focus on. So.
And do you think, earlier you mentioned how, often on the federal scene, the issues that would be most of interest to people are not the issues that end up being in campaigns. Do you think there's a role for that, for finding particular issues that perhaps market research gives you insight or gives you a key, saying, hey, here's something that people are clearly worked up about, passionate about, but it's not in the public discourse? Do you think that's a tactic for expanding voter turnout and political participation?
I do. And I do. I really do. And I think that those kinds of issues are going to play big roles in the next campaign, either for the Liberal Party or for the NDP. But the constraint on discussion that I talked about, I don't think you can keep a lid on that forever. And those issues are starting to boil over, and frustration is starting to boil over about that. And I think that people will be able to run a very strong issue-based campaign about the things that aren't getting addressed and aren't getting done in the country. So I think those kinds of issues are going to be quite significant. And you had a second part to your question that I thought was interesting. Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, and it was is there anything that's changed in campaigning? I mean, you sort of mentioned social media.
Oh, sorry, turnout. We were talking about turnout. That's what I was going to say to you, is that all of the parties are fighting over incredibly marginal shifts of opinion. So 60% or less of the country votes, and if the Conservatives get 39% of that 60, they win, and if they get 33% of that 60, they lose. And so that's really what the fight's about, is that range of people. But if somebody could figure out a way, another party could figure out a way to get 5% more of the population just to vote, right? You'd swamp that fight over that, swamp the importance of that marginal fight over the swing voter that the country's having. But if you don't break out of that cycle, you see what's happening in the States, where they're just fighting over a narrower and narrower band of people. Like, how many people were actually involved in the American election? You had to live in about 6 or 7 states. If you lived in California, you would never have seen a presidential advertisement for either candidate in the entire race. You would never have gotten a call. You would never have... The campaign was not on if you lived in New York or California.
Almost makes you feel sorry for the local TV stations in those markets.
Yeah, they would have had lots of heated other races.
What happens to those issues like Mike Harris got elected on photo radar? It just appealed to a lot of people beyond the base voters. He got people out to vote for photo radar.
Or John Tory getting killed by faith-based funding.
Yeah, when did photo radar? I don't remember when photo radar emerged on the scene, and whether that was a strategic release of the photo radar message, or whether it was just serendipitous thing. Do you remember? How does that because that's the vote grabbing thing. It's that little meme of that makes a difference to a different group of people.
Yeah, when does I mean, a lot of what we talked about tonight was personality, sort of negative campaigning. What about when issue campaigning has that type of role that galvanizes either your supporters or divides the electorate so that everyone's talking about you in a controlled way rather than a negative way?
Well, I mean, something like photo radar is obviously not the most important issue in the province, right? It could not have been at that point. It would be an irritant, right? But something like that could only have really achieved significance if it was a code for something else, if it really was an expression of a broader, and it was after 5 years of Ray and the NDP, and Lynn MacLeod looked like she was going to be the premier, and what was that all about? And that looked like pretty big government stuff too, and finances were getting out of control, and so probably it was a surrogate for big government.
Yeah, for
people, and worked on that level. But you raise another interesting point, which is that there are two different theories about how you win elections going on right now. One is and one's being used by the Conservatives in this country, and that's the micro-targeting. I don't know if any of you have heard of a guy named Patrick Moutart. Mm-hmm. Patrick Moutart was, by all accounts, a very, very brilliant guy who helped design Harper's 06 and 08 campaigns, and now is a consultant in the States. And so the micro-targeting is parents with kids in sports would like a tax credit. People in a certain community in Vancouver are concerned about human smuggling. These kinds of very narrow things like photo radar that actually have nothing to do with the real broad governance of the country, yet can be important enough. If you assemble enough of those things, you assemble a coalition based on these little grabby things that are very tightly focused on a small group of people and are very important to those people and may well be vote determining, right? In its own way, their policy on Israel is another example of this kind of micro-targeting of a community. And a lot of people think that's the way campaigns should all be run. My view is that only works if the campaign's about nothing. Mm-hmm. If people don't think there's anything actually big at stake in the result, then they'll focus on a tax credit or this or that. But if you can create a meta-narrative for the campaign, you will swamp all that micro-targeting stuff.
Mm-hmm. But there's a certain amount of courage to create such a big picture and such a big idea that often does seem lacking from a lot of the folks in politics today.
It does take courage. But that's how John Turner saved the Liberal Party back in 1988, was by getting the country engaged in free trade, right? And that a campaign that was supposed to be a sleepwalk back to power for Mulroney. Their theme was managing change, nothing to pay attention to here, right? Nothing going on. Let's just get through this 35 days. This Turner guy's a joke and all this kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, a big idea was on the table and changed everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Other questions, comments, anecdotes?
Do you believe in the ethnic vote? What are your opinions about that?
What do you mean, do I believe in the ethnic vote?
Do you believe in it? Like, would you have seen that the defeat in 2006 and stuff like that? For my community, Chinese Canadian community, it's a whole heritage issue. I think perhaps in your parlance it would be considered a micro-target issue. But from our point of view as activists, throughout our community, and then creating alliances with other communities over justice sort of thing was a very big thing. We felt that we had more clout than we probably did.
In what?
In terms of getting people out to vote, motivating people that don't traditionally vote. A lot of people in the community, Chinese Canadian community, are known not to vote.
Right.
but we felt that we just sort of, we couldn't really measure it in a huge way, other than sort of anecdotally. We felt that there were quite a few people there.
So, you know, when you say, do I believe in the ethnic vote? Well, I mean, different communities have things that bind them together that are very, very important. And, you know, much of the country's history shows that different communities will vote en masse for or against people based on issues that are quite unique to that community. I mean, there's, you know, for years and years, that's why Francophones wouldn't vote for the Conservatives anywhere in the country. It wasn't just in Quebec that they wouldn't vote for the Conservatives, but a Francophone community in Manitoba would never vote Conservative because of reality. There are Ukrainians in Western Canada that will never vote Liberal because it didn't stand up strongly enough to the famine that was going on. So that is obviously the case, and there was a wave of ethnic urbanization that occurred under Mr. Trudeau that stood the Liberal Party in very good stead for a long time, because people in those communities tended to think that the Liberals played a role in allowing them into the country, and second of all, tended to probably share similar value systems. And I think what the Conservatives have done is they sat back and they took a very strategic look at the ethnic vote, and they said, there are some of those people we either can't appeal to or don't want to appeal to based on what their issues are. But there are some people, and so they started with the Jewish community, and they said, we can have a tougher position on Israel, and that's what Jewish voters want. And they pretty much convinced and converted almost every Jewish voter in the country. I mean, they all used to vote Liberal, and now they almost all vote Conservative. So that's been an extraordinarily successful way. But they have targeted the Chinese Canadian community as well, because they say they're economic conservatives, right? And in some respects, social conservatives. And so that's a group of people that should be voting for us. They're less focused on the South Asians than they are on the Chinese community. So they're taking a very strategic approach, and that whole sort of soft liberal wall of multiculturalism, they've been throwing wedges into that thing and breaking one piece of it off after another.
Seb, or you had your hand up, or Adele?
Okay.
So Canadian.
I don't know how to ask this. I wonder if there's any room for me in the future of the Liberal Party. I feel like I'm mostly a Liberal dissident, because I really didn't like the whole process of how Ignatieff became the head of the Liberal Party. And I feel like the Liberal Party suffers from this elitist culture where all their leaders, it's all about the pedigree. It's like, I'm a lawyer, therefore I'm a natural born liberal leader. Or that's all they have to talk about. I'm a rocket scientist and all of that. And the Conservatives don't do that. They're equally highly educated, but you never see them flaunting their pedigree.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it's hard to relate to liberals. And I've tried to go to these Liberal Party things, and it's very hard to relate to them. Even though I'm a Liberal voter, and well, except for I didn't vote for Ignatieff. But you know what I mean, and I feel like this is why they're doing things terrible, because they're devoid of any ideas, and they're continuing the same pattern of making just send Trudeau the normal heir to the Liberal Party just because his father was a prime minister. So I just feel like, how do you bring people who could change the party into the fold when there's people there already who like the status quo and who want to keep doing the same thing they've been doing, even though it hasn't been successful?
Right. Well, I don't think the party's as elite controlled as the elites would like it to be. There's the person who's supposed to win the leadership doesn't always win the leadership. Trudeau wasn't supposed to win the leadership in 68. According to the elites of the party, nobody knew him. He was an upstart from a. Turner was evidently supposed to win in 84 and could have lost that race if it had gone on a little bit longer. And that Dion got elected leader in one of the messiest democratic processes you'll ever imagine. There was absolutely no elite oversight over what went down at that convention. On the other hand, the Ignatieff succession was a completely staged, managed, internal, caucus-driven thing. Mostly, in fairness, because I actually supported that move, because Dion had committed the party to a coalition, and it was, the party wasn't intellectually in that space that it wanted to go into a coalition, and he was committed to it, and so there was a sense that he had to. He didn't have a mandate for that from the party, and so there was a sense that he had to go. But all that being said, that's not to rebut your point. What do you feel when you're at a Liberal meeting? When you say it's hard to relate, what do you feel?
Just I don't belong. It's not just ideas, but it's different experience too. I think.
And I think the point, Bill talked about how the Tories saw themselves as the party of Main Street compared to the Liberals as the party of Bay Street. And I think, Adil, the way in which you're right, the Tories often don't talk about what got them there. They still try to act like they're the Rob Ford. They're the average guy, even though they're not. They're the, regular person. Versus a Liberal, I think, not always in a malicious way, but they're proud of their accomplishments. And if you look at some of the people even running for the provincial leadership, they're really accomplished, high-accredited folks. And there is kind of that sense that it's the best of the best, which in some respects is good, but in other respects can be alienating if you don't have a law degree. If, you don't have the same level of accreditation that the other folks in the party have.
Well, the traditional positioning the Liberal parties, the traditional, this has all obviously changed rather dramatically in the last few years, but traditionally the Liberal Party was the party of the ins, and the Conservatives were the party of the outs, with the exception of their business backing. But generally, the Liberal Party tended to attract professionals, upwardly mobile, ambitious professionals who either were in it for altruistic reasons or because it might advance their career, but because the Liberal Party was so often in government, it attracted people that were attracted to power, right? And the Conservatives attracted people that were repelled by Liberals. But I think there's still I think the residue of the Liberal Party as it exists probably is too much composed of lawyers and people that work in those glass towers in downtown Toronto, and not enough, more regular folks. But there's also an educational component to this, by the way, which is you will meet different kinds of people at different parties' events. I'll say something reasonably controversial now, but all of the polling, and don't take my word for it, just go and look at any of the publicly available polling and find their breakdown by education level. And you will see that among people who have attended university, the Conservatives are a poor third today among people who've ever attended university. And among people who have only high school educations, Conservatives get about 50% of the vote. And so the people you're going to meet at a Liberal gathering are going to be more educated.
Your ascendancy was kind of the way you put your story relative to this conversation. Your ascendancy in Saskatchewan was kind of love in a time of cholera. Here was a body that was interested in something when nobody else. So theoretically, this is a time of cholera for the Liberal Party. So why are young people like Adele? Is it?
Yeah.
Why would she not? Why would the Liberal Party not
wrap its arms around her and say, please, what can you do? What can you do?
The other difference that I think existed was that it sounds like you weren't ideological in any way when you got taken in.
Right.
And Adele, I think you are more ideological. You have thoughts, so you're not might not be an easy person to recruit. I don't know.
But it was interesting too, and to take issue with your point about education, I think from a party perspective, that speaks to a certain capacity. But on a communications perspective, you almost have to tip your hat to the Tories, that they're communicating in an accessible and popular manner, and that's why I'm still saying Rob Ford's going to get reelected.
Right.
Because in spite of him having no respect of the rule of law, he communicates to his base in a very accessible way that his opponents clearly seem incapable of.
Yeah, I don't really get that. I don't pay a ton of attention to municipal politics. I live in downtown Toronto. I've never met anybody that voted for Rob Ford.
I spend time in Etobicoke, as you know, and up there I meet a lot of people who love Rob Ford and who are really into Rob Ford.
I don't get what the I don't get.
There's lots of people downtown as well.
Yeah.
Voting for Rob.
That's true. Seb,
Well, wait, I want to just finish up with the
Go ahead, yes.
Two things. First of all, I think this is true of the Liberal Party in any era, but I think it's doubly true now, is that if you start showing up with a handful of friends at events, you can go wherever you want to go in the party. You can, it's there. I don't think there's
It's wide open right now.
There's no barriers to entry, and for people who are prepared to bring it, there's never been any barriers to entry. And the second thing is, I'd be happy to talk to you personally about stuff if you want to.
Right on. Right. Seb, I've mentioned your name 4 or 5 times. Why don't you take the opportunity?
So I have, I guess, my question, the aim is sort of both to get a sense of